70-741 Lesson 10 Implementing Network Policy Server or NPS. Network Policy Server NPS is also Radius. In this lesson, you're going to be working on configuring a Radius server, obviously installing the NPS, configuring Radius clients, as well as templates, accounting, certificate, connection requests, and learning import and export of policies. So what is Radius? Radius is an acronym for Remote Authentication Dial-In User Service. It's a networking and client-server protocol, and it provides what we call the AAA, authentication, authorization, and accounting, management for computers that connect and use a network service. It can be used in wireless and remote access connection technologies, 802.1x switches, and remote desktop services. What does that mean? That means we can use it to authenticate the devices that are connecting both to our internal network or attempting to connect to our network from an external source. Radius is defined in the IETF, that's Internet Engineering Task Force, reserved for comment 2865 and 2866. Let's take a brief look at it just to see what's actually defined in. Here's an example showing the RFC, request for comments 2865. And basically it starts out, what's the status, what's the abstract, what's the implementation, and it's how many pages? 76 pages of this text that go down, and a RFC defines exactly what it is. There's an RFC for almost everything, and it goes on and on and on. The challenge and response. How does everything work in that technology? If there's a question on how it needs to be implemented, it's answered here. It's very dry, it's very plain, it doesn't look fancy, but it gives you the information on how things work. So understand that by installing and configuring Radius, it gives you the ability to create and enforce organization-wide network access policies. You can make stipulations. What's the health of a device before it can connect? Connection request authentication, connection request authorization. So in other words, a device is a device allowed to connect. When is it allowed to connect? If it connects, what access does it get? And prior to it connecting, does it meet a certain set of criteria for being able to connect? Understand that authorization is the process that determines what a user is permitted to do on a computer system or network. Authentication is, do I have the correct credentials to allow me or to allow this device to connect? Authorization is what I'm allowed to do after I can. So far all we've been talking about is simply installing a Radius server and kind of how it works. Well, most organizations are going to have larger implementations of Radius. They're going to have multiple Radius servers. First off, it gives you redundancy. You don't want to, if you are reliant on Radius to provide your authentication to devices to connect, you can't have it fail because of a single device failure. That defeats the whole concept of availability. It also gives you better performance. So you can also use what's called a Radius proxy. It sits between the Radius server and the Radius clients. Now, is a client the device that's actually trying to connect? No. Your access clients are the devices that are attempting to connect. The Radius, this is not termed correctly. This should say Radius client. Your Radius clients are those devices that your access clients connect to. they in turn connect to your Radius server. So in this example, you have an old dial-in server running modems, phone modems. Does it? There may be some of you who aren't even familiar with what a phone modem is, other than from the context of learning Network Plus. We don't even Phone modems are not even part of a device anymore. It's old, ancient technology. But those devices that would need to do that, they used the what's do you remember what POTS indicates? POTS, plain old telephone system. They use an analog connection. They dial up. They connect to the dial-in server. It connects to the NPS server, verifies their authentication, verifies their authorization, and away they go. The VPN server, controlling via VPN connection. Wireless access points. This can be internal. So, is a device allowed to connect to your wireless network? If it does, what access is it provided? And then the same thing with your 802.1x enabled switches. So when we go to configure our NPS as a Radius server, there's two configurations: standard configuration or advanced configuration. Our standard configuration is to configure your Radius server for dial-up or VPN connections, or as a server for 802.1x wireless or wired connections. So if you are going to configure it as a dial-up or for VPN connections, you have to create a network policy. And when you're doing your lab, you're going to walk through the setup of doing that network policy, and here are those step-by-step instructions as well. They are all in your PowerPoint, just the same way as we've seen time and time again. In a similar manner, if you were going to configure it for 802.1x or wireless connections, you would run through the wizard following these steps. Another term that you need to be familiar with is radius accounting. This is how you track network usage for auditing or billing purposes. For example, you may be running a service that requires you to track the usage so that a client is billed. Now, that logging can be saved on the NPS server, or it can connect to a SQL Server database. Logs can get very large, so the optimum configuration would be to connect to a SQL Server database. This would be a server that is its simple goal is running a SQL Server database. That's all it does. It's designed to be the most efficient way for you to access and write that information. So unless you're running a very small network, you would not store your logs locally on the NPS server. You would want to connect to a SQL Server database. How do devices authenticate? Well, you can use password-based credentials. Much more secure is certificate-based credentials. If you use a certificate, certificates are designed, they're digital certificates, and they're designed that they can't be modified. So, for example, the classroom computers, they use a certificate that is distributed through a group policy that allows them to authenticate through the wireless access point to a Radius server. There's absolutely nothing we need to do to make that connection. It happens automatically because the certificate is valid and it allows that access. Passwords can be hacked. Passwords can be stolen. Passwords can be compromised. So given the option of passwords or certificates, the best way to do your deployment is using certificate-based credentials. If we're using our NPS for dial-up or VPN, we stated earlier that it was necessary to have an NPS policy. What is an NPS policy? It's a set of permissions or restrictions that are used by remote access authenticating servers to determine who, when, and how a client can connect. So, what clients are allowed to connect? When are they allowed to connect? And how can they connect? You can these connections can be authorized or denied based on certain attributes, group memberships, time of day, type of connection. There's a great many variables that you can use to define those NPS policies. There are two different types of NPS policies: a connection request policy and a network policy. The connection request policy is a set of conditions and settings that specify which Radius servers perform the AAA of connection requests received by the NPS server from the Radius clients. Remember, your Radius clients are the devices that your access clients are connecting to. The Radius clients are in between the device that's actually trying to make the connection and your NPS server. A network policy establishes the conditions, the constraints, and the settings that specify who's authorized to connect to the network and the circumstances under which they can or cannot connect. So if we're working in an environment with multiple NPS servers and we have to define all these different policies, it can get very complicated. How do we know that one employee or one administrator created this exact same policy that was created on another server? Well, through the use of NPS templates, we can simplify that process, also known as Radius templates. Remember, NPS and Radius are interchangeable in the Microsoft world. We can create those configuration elements and save them as templates so they can be exported and imported on other NPS servers to make sure that we have a uniform set of policies. They're designed to reduce the amount of time and the cost it takes to configure Radius. So you could be able to import a specific set of templates across the board and know that everything has a uniform look, uniform feel, uniform configuration. So in your reading of this lesson, you have learned what Radius, Remote Authentication Dial-In User Service, is. That it's a networking and client server protocol. It provides the AAA, authentication, authorization, and accounting. And it controls what computers can connect and use a network service. It can be used with wireless and remote access technologies, 802.1x switches, and remote desktop services gateways. Microsoft Radius is Network Policy Server. NPS is Radius. Radius is NPS. By installing and configuring Radius, you can create and enforce organization-wide network access policies. What is the health of a device? Does it meet certain criteria before it's allowed to connect? What devices are allowed to connect? When are they allowed to connect? If they are allowed to connect and they were able to authenticate, what authorization do they have to have what access on your network? In some environments, you'll create a Radius proxy. It forwards those authentication and accounting messages to other Radius servers. When NPS is set up as a Radius proxy, the NPS becomes a central switching or routing point through which Radius access and accounting messages flow. So it allows you to diverge various streams of data to the specific NPS server that carries the actual service, whether it's accounting or whether it's providing, doing that access, what it might actually do. Remember our illustration here where the proxy defines exactly which NPS server gets the traffic. And finally, remember that NPS supports that radius accounting feature that you can use to track network usage. This concludes 70-741 Lesson 10. Thank you very much.